our family devotion. Been reading through it for some time now, and I like the book of Nehemiah because there's a lot to be learned about the book of Nehemiah. There's a lot for children, adults, families. The continuous succession, the first person talking and speaking of the book of Nehemiah. It's very important just to consider the acts that happen in the book of Nehemiah. I'd like you to go to chapter 4. We're going to read verse 6 for our text. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6. So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof. For the people had a mind to work. The people had a mind to work. The title of the message this morning is For the People Have a Mind to Work. We live in a time where our mind has got to be with the consideration of our working. The book of Nehemiah is so interesting to me because they didn't just work in a spiritual sense. They worked in a secular sense, a physical sense. They protected. So much is going on. For context this morning, we're going to read through we're going to have a lengthy reading at a few different junctures. And the reading is really to set up the context quickly. I'd love to come back and very much study the book of Nehemiah in depth. For our message this morning, we're using what the Lord has given us. If you go back to chapter 1 of the book, you see in verse 3 of chapter 1, my first point will come out of this passage, and we're going to see what's going to happen in the book of Nehemiah. And my first point for the message this morning is God's man for God's time. Something I believe very, very specifically about the Lord's churches and about how God's people are led is because God selects a man for his time. Now, this message isn't about me. This message isn't about necessarily this church. This message is about the mind to work and how God gives us a mind to work. And in chapter 1 of verse 3 it says, And they said unto me, The remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Nehemiah had a burden. Nehemiah had a burden for the people. God created that burden, authorized that burden. When God calls people to do a work or calls people to a place, He will provide them with a leader. You know, Nehemiah, in verse 3 it says, the remnant that are left of the captivity, they're in the province are in great affliction and reproach. We're talking about the post-exile of the Israelites. We're talking about what happened at that time. The Babylonian captivity, when Babylonians came in and they crushed the walls of Jerusalem. They crushed the temple. They left it in rubble. As we were talking about, I made mention of this text partially already and how I talked with the kids about if you build blocks, and in building those blocks, when you knock them over, they just kind of spread, don't they? And then if you're one of the unfortunate ones, you might step on one of those said blocks with a bare foot. And you're living in reproach at that point. I was thinking about this. Brother Tyler Riles came in and he measured the ceiling. And he said to the top of that ceiling is 13 feet, which I got to believe it's higher than that, but he did it 3 times. He said it's 13 feet. I thought it was 15, 16 feet. The walls of Jerusalem were 39 feet tall when they were built. They're 8 feet thick, and they were 2.5 miles long. That's a big wall. And so they're living with the rubble. I mean, you could do the math. I didn't choose to, but they're living with the rubble of a 39-foot, 8-foot wide, 2.5 mile long stones all over. Nehemiah, he's burdened by the affliction of the Jews. At the current moment, they didn't have protection in Jerusalem. They weren't allowed to rebuild the wall. Enemies could come in and out. Then we flip back to Nehemiah. We know the living condition. And we know that, I'm trying to think how I would say this most simply. Nehemiah was a man of great ability. He served as a royal guard in the king's Persian court. He was the cupbearer. He was the one that, at the time, the Eastern kings, they were very concerned with somebody poisoning the drink. And so they only used their most trusted and their closest to give them their drink. That was Nehemiah's job. He was that close, he was that trusted by the king as a Jew. I would talk about this first point about God's man for God's time. Nehemiah didn't live in Jerusalem. It's believed that Nehemiah was born in Persia. That other than the fact that his lineage was a Jew, he was never there. And in verse 3, he has such a burden for how the Jews are living in Jerusalem. How the Israelites are living. In verse 4, it's going to start one of our more lengthy readings. We're going to read through the end of the chapter. And it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept, there's the burden, and mourned certain days, and fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven. And then we pick up in verse 5, and it's him praying, and he said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God, that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him, and observe his commandments. Let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee now day and night for the children of Israel, thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have dealt very corruptly against thee. We have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments which thou commandest thy servant Moses. Remember, I beseech thee, the word that thou commandest thy servant Moses, saying, if ye transgress, I will scatter you abroad among the nations. But if ye turn unto me and keep my commandments and do them, though there were of you cast out unto the uttermost part of the heaven, yet will I gather them from thence, and will bring them into the place that I have chosen to set my name there. Now these are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by thy great power and by thy strong hand. O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants, who desire to fear thy name and prosper. I pray thee, thy servant, this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. We see that when we speak on God's man for God's time, Nehemiah had a burden for the children that were left in Jerusalem. He had a burden for their protection. He had the burden for them to get up and build. He had the burden for them to restore Jerusalem, to restore their living conditions, restore order. We see that he had a comfortable life. He had a purpose. He had a place to be. We see that even in his comfortable life and his purpose and his serving of King Artaxerxes, I'm trying to remember how to say his name, is in chapter 2. Artaxerxes. We see that even in his time, he knew of the scriptures, these scriptures that Moses had said. He prays. He asks for forgiveness. He prays with recognizing that the children of Israel, they left what God had done. They sought after other gods. They didn't keep the judgments. They didn't keep the commandments. But Lord, you can restore us. Lord, restore us. And then at the end, he goes, grant him mercy in the sight of this man, the king. It was the king's decree not to build the wall. It was the king's decree to let Jerusalem lay in ruin, lay in reproach. You know, he weeps, he fasts, he mourns, he prays. I believe when God's people are afflicted, God's men mourn. You know, I say for myself, if the people are afflicted, my heart is troubled. Yours should be too. When God calls a man, and everything I say in this message is future tense. Because we don't know what the Lord's plan is. My wife sent me something on Friday, I think it was. Yeah, I think it was Friday morning. And it just never crossed my mind. But she sent me this thing that said the average pastor pastors 5 years before, or pastors not 5 years before they stop. I think is essentially what it said. 5 years. They don't make it 5 years because of the burden of the job, because of the people, because of the workload. And I'd never considered this to be a job that you could quit. I just thought when you were called, you were called. And see, that's why there's and then it's even funnier. You go to, for me, I've got a LinkedIn profile that I've had established for years now. And I went to jobs. And now that I'm a pastor, it suggests me churches I can go work for. There's all kinds of jobs as a pastor. I could go to all sorts of denominations. I mean, I could just really make some interesting interviews. And then I could submit my resume to the councils and the committees and to the associate pastors and see if I would be approved. And you would be shocked when you see how many churches are hiring pastors. Brother Matt was talking this morning about serving two masters. Boy, I could be a worship leader. I'm ordained now. It works. I could be a worship leader. I could be a music worship leader. I could be a youth leader. I could be an associate pastor. I could be a head pastor. I'm the head pastor here, so I have experience of 3 months. And there's all sorts of jobs. Do you know why? Because they're not God's men for God's time. And this message is future tense. Because I don't know how long the Lord would allow me to pastor before he takes me away, takes me home, takes me to a new place. I remember Brother Dan Gordon talking about how much he loved pastoring Zoar Baptist Church. He didn't want to go when he was called away to Michigan. He goes, oh, I could have just stayed at Zord Baptist Church forever. I hope I don't get called away. I hope I don't get called away. But you need to know this. Because it's God's man for God's time. You need to look for someone that has the burden that God has placed in them. Somebody that fasts, that mourns, that hurts, that prays, that prays that the work would be done. That the church work would be done. If you ever called to preach, as I give Clark a hard time. I said, I send him these little texts all the time. Pay attention, we don't have long together, I'll say. And he'll go, no. And I said, no, we don't have long together. You're going to go somewhere. I'm sure of it. We're not going to be here together for that long. Pay attention, I'll say. You ought to, if anybody is called away, you have to pray and seek. You have to. Yeah, it's going to be 6:05 all day long, so I should be fine till 6:05. But it requires great attention, great prayer. Nehemiah, he's being called in a different way. He's being called to lead the people. We see his prayer. We see him referencing Scripture. We see that Nehemiah has such a burden. So God's man for God's time. The second point is God sends his man with full authority. If God's man is truly here, he'll have full authority. In chapter 2, it says, and it came to pass in verse 1, it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. Now why could he not be sad in his presence? How could you walk before the king handing him his drink and being sad? The king is going to think there's something wrong. You're trying to take his life. Wherefore the king said unto me, why is thou countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid. You know what happened to cupbearers when they were sad in the king's presence? They were killed. They were taken care of. They couldn't be sad. The image that it created. And we see that in the end of verse 2, Nehemiah says, then I was very sore afraid. Then said unto the king, let the king live forever. He got that out of the way, didn't he? King, I want you to live forever. It's not you. Why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Then the king said unto me, for what dost thou make request? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said unto the king, if it please the king, and if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. And the king said unto me, the queen also sitting by him, for how long shall thy journey be, and when wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. God provides the way. God provides the way. This king had made a decree to not build the wall. After Nehemiah's diligent prayer, fasting, his asking for repentance, and his having faith that God would deliver his people as promised, we see that God answers prayer for Nehemiah and provides the way. Not only did the king receive his sadness with compassion, He empowered him, gave a new decree. I'm not going to read the rest of chapter 2, but in the rest of chapter 2, part of the next few verses in chapter 2, the king provides him with materials to build, to do what he's supposed to do. He also sends him with protection, with authority. We see, and we're talking about Nehemiah, and we're going to get to the real meat of this in a minute, but it takes godly, authoritative leadership to build, to do what's supposed to be done. There's people trying to build churches, start churches, and they don't have the right leadership. They don't have the right authority. They don't have the right truth. They don't have the right Bible, the right scriptures. They don't have anything. One of my favorite parts starts in verse 11. My third point, God's men, not just the preachers, not just the pastors. This is to the men of the Lord's churches. God's men should arise, as did Nehemiah. Arise and inspect the work that needs to be done. In verse 11 of chapter 2, so I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. I want you to think about something. Nehemiah, he could have very easily asked the king to send somebody in, couldn't he? I mean, he was on the king's right hand. He obviously had authority. He had the ability to talk to the king. He went himself to Jerusalem. There's a lot of people that are afraid to get their hands dirty when things need to be done. And Nehemiah was not. And I arose in the night, and as some few men with me, neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. He got up. He got up in the middle of the night because there was a work that needed to be done. Too oftentimes we expect this collective work to just be done because it needs to be done, don't we? When God has appointed leaders, and again, I'm not just talking about pastors and preachers, but that can also be the case. You have leadership in your homes. You have a need for walls in your homes, for defenses in your homes, for leadership in your homes. How can you expect to be a leader if you're not present? How can you expect to be a leader if you're not paying attention? If you're just not willing to get up before everybody else? He got up in the middle of the night, and some few men with him. And he walked. Now I want you to think back now, 39 feet, 8 foot wide, 2.5 miles long, buildings destroyed. They didn't just come in and destroy the wall, they destroyed buildings. They destroyed the tabernacle. I believe it was 585 BC. 586 BC, the Babylonians came in, they destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed it. In 535 BC, the Jews were allowed to come in and build the temple. Nehemiah takes the setting in 445 BC. 445 BC. 141 years later, Nehemiah arrives on scene. That means these few people at one time, at the time of the exile, if I remember reading it correctly, and I could be, I'm second guessing, I'm going to use the number for the moment, but I thought I remembered reading there was something like 100,000 people that dwelled inside of Jerusalem at the time. And when you think about the size of Jerusalem, that would make sense. But there's something like 70 to 100,000 people that's believed to have dwelled in Jerusalem. There's a few left, and Jerusalem is demolished, and people are pulled out. And it just sat there like blocks on the ground for 141 years. And Nehemiah finally had the Lord send him with the authority to do something, and he gets up in the middle of the night, and that's the thing to think about. And he goes and he inspects the walls, inspects the damage. And I went out, in verse 13, I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, into the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. Then I went on to the gate of the fountain, and to the king's pool, but there is no place for the beast that was under me to pass. Then went I up in the night by the brook, and viewed the wall, and turned back, and entered into the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not whither I went, or what I did, neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. Then said I unto them, Ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. He examined the damage. He gives a plan. He has sought God on what to do. And then he says, we're going to get this done. We're going to keep it from lying in waste any longer. You know, men, we have to inspect the damage. There is people in our lives right now that are trying to break down the walls at home. There is things right now that are trying to break the walls down at home. We got to get up and inspect the damage. Pray, seek the Lord. Ask for forgiveness if anything needs to be forgiven, and fortify the walls around us. There were spots in the wall that were just, or in Jerusalem, that were just so difficult to pass. I mean, the wall in Jerusalem was literally stones. When you think about that. We see in verse 18 as our fourth point, God's men are given divine instruction. God's men are given divine instruction. Nehemiah was used by God in verse 18 to build the wall. Chapter 3, we're not reading it, but I would encourage you to read some of it, all of it. Chapter 3 talks about everybody that had a hand in rebuilding the city, except for verse 5. And next to them, the Techites repaired, but their nobles put not their necks to the work of the Lord. There's something wrong with people who do not want to get their hands dirty. We'll see what happens to them possibly down the road. But there's something wrong with people that don't want to get their hands dirty. we see that they sat back and let everybody else do their work. These nobles in Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 5, they sat back. But the work still got done, didn't it? The work still was completed. You know, you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Verse 13 says, every man's work shall be made manifest. For the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. And the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. Our spiritual work, our life is going to be made manifest by our labors. We see that in the book of Nehemiah was given that burden, wasn't he? He wasn't afraid to take that burden and pray to the Lord for it. And once he received instruction to go, he got up. He modeled leadership. We can't be afraid to model leadership in our homes today. Us men, you got to get up. You got to model leadership. This is not a slight to our ladies, and I'm not taking anything from our ladies. But the book of Nehemiah doesn't say that Nehemiah's mom got up. That Nehemiah's wife got up. It says that Nehemiah got up. And he had a few men that went with him. Men, you ought to rise up. The people have a mind to work because good men led them to have a mind to work. Our human bodies are so frail, right? But don't ever forget that they're designed by God. They're able by God to do the things in which that we need to do. Nehemiah, he makes a plan. All of our work, it's going to be made known. What a shame is it if we act like the nobles who are lazy, who sit back and don't do the service to the Lord. Now, this could apply to the Lord's house. This could apply to your house. This could apply to a pastor or preacher that likes to point the finger or likes to sit back and let everybody else do the work. This is a dual application message. God's house and ours. The fifth and last point. Divine leadership lasts and unifies. Fake leaders are going to do what happens in the world today. You watch the debate of the two best America can produce. You had two people that didn't want to answer any political question because they don't believe they can get in office by answering a political question. I was actually shocked that Kamala Harris said she stood with Israel. That was one of the only things I actually heard somebody answer in the debate. I was shocked that she would actually say that. But the country that we live in is divided. It's split right down the middle. And divine leadership unites everybody. In Psalm 133, verse 1, we should know it. It's a real familiar passage. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. God sent his man in the book of Nehemiah to go and unite the people. 141 years, these few that were left in Jerusalem were living there with no protection, no building, no wall, buildings laying in rubble, stone everywhere, unpassable to places. The city of Jerusalem was designed with 12 gates around it, and each gate had its purpose. When the Lord leads, as He leads in your home, if you're truthfully seeking Him, when the Lord leads, others will follow you. Your home will follow you. Your home will be unified. You have to do what Nehemiah did in chapter 1 and rise up and repent and seek Him and ask for guidance and ask for mercy. And we see in chapter 4, back to our text, in chapter 4, verse 6 in Nehemiah, it says, "So built we the wall." Nehemiah gathers them together. He assigned tasks to them, and they built the wall. And all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof. For the people had a mind to work. What didn't they have in the last 141 years? The Lord hadn't given anybody the burden to get the people together and build the wall. They built the temple some 70 years ago. But they didn't build the wall. Divine leadership lasts, it unifies. Those walls were broken down for years. Nehemiah, he produced the unity by his leadership. God gave him the ability to produce the unity. You see that even the few nobles that wanted to spoil the lot, they did not change the unity because the people had a mind to work. In a time where many people wanted to destroy the Jews, no doubt there were many breaches of the walls. We know that because of scriptures that I am on purpose not reading today for time's sake. When we look at Tobiah, the Ammonite, when we look at Sanballat, these ones that heard that were enemies, there's 4 times in the book of Nehemiah where Sanballat is trying to draw Nehemiah out. We're just looking at one aspect of Nehemiah's leadership today. Just one. Because there's so many times, in the 4 times, there's 4 basically tricks that Sanballat uses to try to draw Nehemiah out. We see Nehemiah didn't put himself on a pedestal. We see that Nehemiah didn't take the bait. Nehemiah was wise. He was strong. He stayed in the middle of what was going on. True leaders stay in the middle. You got all these quote-unquote morons today. You get on some professional site. I'm sorry, I just have to say it. I'm sorry. You get on some professional site like LinkedIn and you're like, oh, you lead this way. Oh, you lead this way. You lead from the front. You lead from the back. No, you ask God for leadership and you lead just the exact way that God gives you leadership. Wherever that is, He puts you. They were building this wall with many enemies around them. There's a recording of them building the wall and whose jobs it was to build the wall. And we see in verse 6, it says, "So built we the wall, and all the wall that was joined together into the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and the breaches began to be stopped." They could just go in and out whenever they wanted to, couldn't they? And the breaches began to stop. That they were very wroth. We've taught Rem what wroth and wrath means. He's looking up at me because he knows. Yep, he said it. He knows what wrath and wrath means. And conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. They're angry. They wanted to fight and stop the progress. Nevertheless, what did they do? What did leadership do what did that divine leadership do in the face of oppression? The same thing that we should do in our homes today. We made our prayer under God and set a watch against them day and night because of them. The Lord doesn't just say pray and let whatever happens going to happen. See, sometimes we get lost because we use the term sovereign grace so much that we forget that we do have a responsibility in protecting our homes, in protecting the Lord's churches, in protecting our families. If we look at that verse, it says, we made our prayer unto God, and we set a watch night and day. That was the divine leadership that Nehemiah was given. We're going to build the wall. And Judah said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall. That wall was half built. Your home is going to have some half-built walls sometimes. Boy, you're going to get the first half up quick, aren't you? You're going to begin to stop those breaches real quick. See, we have a responsibility to have a mind to work. And that just doesn't mean that we just read our Bible for ourselves. And maybe expect our wife to read the Bible to herself. That doesn't mean that we sit by and we just, the Lord's going to provide. The money's just going to come in, right? I'm not taking away from God's sovereign grace. That's why we have jobs. Each one of us put our shoes on the same way every morning. And it still requires 2 shoes to go to work. And you have a responsibility not only to protect your home, but to provide for it spiritually, physically, emotionally. Us men, we have such a responsibility, and we can get so excited. Things are going well. And then we get to verse 10 and we go, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish. We don't get to sit by. Men, you're not nobles of your homes. You're leaders. You have great responsibility. You're bearers of burdens as much. You may have to read your own Bible. You do need to read your own Bible. You need to teach your family. You need to live the right way. You need to live clean. You need to live with leadership. You need to live with guidance. You need to live with protection. You have to have the mind to work at home and at work. We live in a life now where people, they go, all right, I'm done. I'm done going to work. And I'll be honest, I believe that some of the generations that came before me, I would get a finger pointed at me a lot, but I believe they're wrong. I believe they started some of these issues. You want to know why? Because the men would come home and put their feet up and expect the women to do everything for them. That's not necessarily submission, that's laziness. You have a responsibility to do something. You have children, they're yours too. Raise them, teach them, feed them, clean them, care for them. You have a wife, that's your responsibility. Men, we don't get the option to just go home and put our feet up. You know why? Because that's when the breaches begin to break. That's when the walls start tumbling down. These bodies that we have were divinely created to work. It's not some new revelation, but you think about it, you start looking at men that retire. Unless they've stepped into generational wealth, how many of those men really live long after retirement? Not long. My grandfather retired in 2010 from the ministry. And he put his feet up. And he didn't live long. So, men, I kindly challenge you and I kindly ask you one thing. Get over yourself and your need to sit. And get up and lead by the example that Nehemiah has given us. Don't be afraid to rise up. Don't be afraid to pray. Don't be afraid to repent. Don't be afraid to get right. When affliction comes, pray, don't act. Lead by example. You want to know what happened in Nehemiah? You want to know what happened to the wall? Because we've all get to that point in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 10, when the burdens are heavy. And it usually doesn't happen, and this is, again, not a slight to anybody else, but when the burdens are heavy at home, it's not usually because they're heavy for us, is it? It's because they're heavy for our wives, for our kids, for our families. And all of a sudden, man, we just start to fall. We just got to go sit and put our feet up. Take action. Pray. Lead. Nehemiah didn't let them say, you need a rest. In the coming passages of Nehemiah, you know what he did instead? Half of you, this half right here, you are going to sit at watch from sun up till sundown. You're going to watch. You're going to watch for anybody to come out. You're going to build. And at sundown, you're going to take watch and you're going to build. We're not going to take time to wash. We're not going to take time to sleep. We're not going to take time to do anything until the wall is built. If you hear the sound of the trumpet near me, come to me, because that is where danger is. He planned everything. And in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 15, in closing, it says, so the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month Elul, in 52 days. Now the wall was knocked down, I believe, in the 3rd century. 2nd or 3rd century. I don't know the dimensions, but I believe they built the wall back to the previous dimensions. 52 days they built and cleared the rubble to build a wall that was 2.5 miles long, 39 feet tall, and 8 feet thick. And they built the gates that were for it too. Because the people had a mind to work. We have to have a mind to work. I, myself, was so lazy. For the last couple of years, you know what? I just wanted a job that I could work at home. I just wanted a job that I could spend more time with my kids. I wanted a job that I could be more present. My kids need to see what Dad does. I don't get to play with my kids often. I have to tell my kids, no, I can't throw the football, Leo. More times than I can say, yes, Leo, I can throw the football. I have to tell Ophelia, no, I can't color with you more times than I tell her I can color with her. But I'm trying to teach them that we must have a mind to work. I have a physical job. I had a guy tell me his dad started off as a rep that I met on my first day, came back in Friday. Now I was tired Friday. Up with Remy all night with his leg messed up, and part of the night, my wife looked at me, part of the night I was up with him. I was tired, and I won't live that one down. And he said, oh, you were the preacher? I said, yeah. What church is it? And he's from Gilbertville, and we were talking, and he goes, oh, yeah, my dad was a bivocational preacher too. And I'm like, what in the world is a bivocational preacher? I asked him that. He goes, well, he worked a full-time job, and then he was a pastor. He was an associate pastor of a Pentecostal church, and then left for a few years, and then he went and he finished his ministry out in a General Baptist church. And he goes, how many associate pastors do you have? And I said, none. So I'm the only one that week in and week out prepare services. And he goes, how many do you have? I said 3. And he goes, and you work full time? He goes, yeah, you're a bivocational preacher. And he was nice to me. But my kids need to see and need to understand that I have a job to do. My first job is to pastor the church. My second job is to take care of them. And my third job is to work. And I have to have a mind to work, even though I get discouraged and frustrated. Friday was frustrating for me. I'm playing this yo-yo game at work right now, where I'm asked to do something and I do it and I get it done and the results, and then we go backwards and we go a different way because we don't have the patience for things to manifest, in my opinion. And that's okay. It's not up to me. I'll do what I have to do. But it's so stressful to yo-yo all the time, just constant. And my kids need to see that. And I can't be defeated by that. Neither can you. We, as men, we have to have a mind to work. You're the encourager, the disciplinarian, the leader, the protector, the spiritual leader, the prayer warrior. That is your responsibility in your home. If you drop one of those hats, the breaches start coming in. Pay attention. Be careful. God's given you a family. You take a look around. Sometimes I wish some of you could see from the perspective that I see. Because I get to look at the families. I get to look at what God has blessed you all and me with. And sometimes we forget that these two things called eyes that we just look out of, with our perspective, we forget about their perspective. One of the biggest blessings for me is to be able to pastor to my family. But I get to look out and I get to see my sons and my daughter and my wife sitting out there. And their perspective. Men, have some perspective. Have some perspective about your role and the needs of your family. We're blessed. Don't let the walls sit broken down. Women, you play an active part. You support. You bear burdens too. You have to have the mind to work, which means you work on things that you do wrong. And that can be said about all of us, can't it? You work on things that you know you need to work on. And you strive. And this is the last thing I'll say. That clock hasn't moved an inch. I'm still doing good. This is the last thing I'll say in closing. Women, you strive to keep the unity in your home. Oftentimes, you're the one that invites other people in. You keep the unity, you keep the submission, you follow after the divine leadership that you've been given. And you do that, your home will have a mind to work. Brother, you come, we'll sing a verse, a song, finish our services for the day.